The year was 1876, and the Arizona Territory was a canvas of baked earth and brittle light. The air itself, usually thin and sharp with the scent of sage and sun-scorched rock, had grown heavy, thick with a grit that foretold a reckoning. Evelyn Hart felt it in her teeth, a fine powder that had worked its way past the canvas flap of the wagon. The sky, a brilliant, unforgiving blue only hours ago, was now a bruised yellow, the color of old parchment. The wind had started as a whisper, a sly thief that stole the warmth from her shawl, but it was now a rising howl that made the wagon shudder on its axles. She had been traveling with the convoy for weeks, a lone Englishwoman swallowed by the vastness of an American dream that felt more like a fevered nightmare. Her world had become a monotonous rhythm of creaking wheels and the plodding gait of tired horses. But this evening, that rhythm was broken. The wind struck with the force of a physical blow, a solid wall of sand and fury that tore at the world. Her driver, a man with a leathery face and eyes squinted from a lifetime of staring into the sun, shouted something lost to the gale. The wagon lurched, tilted at an impossible angle, and then the world became a chaotic tumble of splintering wood, flying canvas, and the terrified scream of a horse. When the motion stopped, Evelyn was sprawled on the hard desert floor, the overturned wagon a wrecked skeleton beside her. The wind ripped the bonnet from her head, sending it cartwheeling into the swirling gloom. Pain bloomed in her shoulder, a hot, insistent throb. But the cold was a more immediate threat, seeping through her traveling dress, which was now torn at the hem and coated in a layer of sand that felt like a shroud. She pushed herself up, her hands raw, and called out for the driver, for anyone. The storm swallowed her voice. The horse, panicked and free of its traces, was a fleeting shadow vanishing into the maelstrom. She was alone. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to coil in her stomach. She fought it down with a stubborn pride that had been her only true companion since leaving the misty shores of England. Fear was a luxury the desert did not permit. Captain Rohr's face flashed in her mind, his smile thin and possessive, his voice smooth as he spoke of taming wild things. He had considered her one of them, a creature to be owned and displayed. That memory, more than the wind, chilled her to the bone and ignited a spark of defiance. She would not die here. She would not become a ghost for him to gloat over. Survival was a simple, brutal equation. She needed shelter. She needed fire. With the last of the daylight being strangled by the storm, she saw it. A flicker, a tiny, defiant pinprick of orange far off in the gloom, appearing and disappearing as the curtain of sand shifted. It could be anything, a trick of the light, a figment of her desperate imagination, or it could be salvation. She had no other choice. Pulling her shawl tighter, she turned her back on the wreckage of her former life and began to walk toward the light. Each step was an act of faith. The wind pushed against her, a relentless bully trying to force her to her knees. Sand scoured her face, filling her eyes and mouth. She stumbled over rocks she could not see, her thin-soled boots offering little protection. The fire was her only compass. It seemed to recede with every step she took, a cruel star leading her deeper into the wilderness. Her hope began to fray, worn thin like the fabric of her dress. Just as despair began to set in, she nearly fell over a ledge. Below her, nestled in a deep overhang carved into a sheer rock face, the fire burned steadily. It was small, contained by a ring of stones, its flames dancing with a life that seemed impossible in the face of the storm's violence. A figure sat beside it, motionless, a silhouette against the glow. The person was wrapped in a blanket, form indistinct, but the stillness was absolute, as if the storm was a minor inconvenience not worthy of notice. Evelyn hesitated at the edge of the rocky slope, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was the Arizona Territory. She had heard the stories in the trail camps, whispered tales of scalpings and raids, of men who were more spirit than flesh, who moved without sound and dealt only in death. The figure by the fire could be her end, but the wind was a razor, and the cold was already making her limbs feel clumsy and distant. To stay out in the open was certain death. To go down there was a chance. She scrambled down the incline, loose grease skittering under her boots. The noise loud in the relative quiet of the rock shelter. The figure did not flinch. As she reached the level ground, the firelight illuminated him, and her breath caught in her throat. He was Apache. His black hair was long, held back by a simple leather band. His face was all harsh angles and shadows, his cheekbones high, his jaw set. He wore buckskin leggings and a worn cotton shirt, but it was his eyes that held her, dark and unreadable. They watched her approach without welcome, without surprise, simply with an unnervous assessment. A long, thin scar, pale against his copper skin, cut a path from his temple to his jaw, a permanent ghost of some past violence. She stopped a few feet from the circle of firelight, the heat a blessed relief on her frozen skin. She stood straight, refusing to show the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "My wagon overturned in the storm," she said, her voice hoarse. "My horse ran." The man said nothing. He simply watched her, his gaze missing no detail: her torn dress, her trembling hands, the sand matted in her auburn hair. The silence stretched, filled only by the howl of the wind outside their sanctuary. He seemed to be a part of the rock itself, ancient and unmoving. "I need shelter," she finally added, the words feeling small and pathetic. "Just until the storm passes." He shifted then, a slight, economical movement. When he spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, his English accented but clear. "Shelter is here. The fire is here." He gestured with his chin toward the far side of the rock overhang, a dark space away from the flames. "Your place is there." It was not an invitation. It was a statement of fact, a drawing of a line. The fire was his. The warmth was his. She was an intruder, granted a sliver of his space out of some inscrutable logic of his own. The coldness in his tone was more biting than the wind. "Thank you," she managed, her pride stinging. She was Evelyn Hart, daughter of a well-respected family, and she was being treated like a stray dog. Yet she knew she had no right to his warmth, his safety. She had stumbled into his world uninvited. She moved to the spot he had indicated, sinking down onto the cold, sandy floor. The darkness there was almost complete, and the warmth of the fire barely reached her. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, watching him. He had turned his attention back to the flames, feeding a piece of dry mesquite into the coals. He moved with a quiet deliberation, every action purposeful. She noticed a rifle leaning against the rock wall within his easy reach. Beside him lay a long knife in a beaded sheath. He was not a man to be trifled with. Time passed. The storm raged, a wild animal clawing at the mouth of their cave. But inside the shelter, a tense peace held. Evelyn's fear slowly subsided, replaced by a profound exhaustion. The man remained a statue by the fire. He had not asked her name, nor offered his. He had not asked how she came to be there, nor what she would do when the sun rose. The present moment was all that mattered. Finally, unable to bear the rigid formality of their separation any longer, she spoke into the darkness. "What is your name?" He looked at her, his expression unchanged. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer. "Taza," he said, the name a short, hard sound. "I am Evelyn Hart." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if filing the information away for reasons she could not guess. "The desert does not care about names. Evelyn Hart. It cares if you can find water. It cares if you can make fire. It cares if you are strong enough to see the next sunrise." His words were not meant to be cruel. They were simply true. It was a truth she had been learning every day on this harsh, beautiful land. Here, pedigrees and pleasantries were useless currency. "I will not be a burden," she said, her voice stronger now. "When the storm breaks, I will leave." Taza looked out toward the screaming wind, then back at her. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his dark eyes. "The desert does not spare the weak," he said, his voice flat. "A statement of law, not a threat. If you stay, you learn to live." His words hung in the air between them, a challenge and a promise. Stay. The word implied a possibility she had not considered. Where would she go? The wagon train was gone. The world she knew was gone. She was adrift. To stay here, with this silent, formidable man, was a terrifying prospect. But to leave, to walk back out into that sand-blasted wilderness alone, was suicide. The first rays of dawn were still hours away. The storm showed no signs of abating. In the small, protected space beneath the rock, two people from different worlds sat in silence, separated by culture, by history, by suspicion, but bound by the most fundamental human needs: warmth, water, and a place to hide from the wind. Evelyn watched the flames dance in the reflection of Taza's eyes. The fire was a boundary, a clear line drawn in the sand between his life and hers. But it was also a shared point of light in an overwhelming darkness, a fragile truce against the chaos that raged just beyond the mouth of the cave. For now, it was enough. The morning broke in silence. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured and still, as if holding its breath. The air was cold and clean, smelling of wet sand and the sharp, resinous perfume of creosote bush. Evelyn woke to a landscape reborn, the soft light of dawn painting the red rocks in hues of rose and gold. Every muscle in her body ached with a deep, protesting soreness. She was stiff from the cold, and the place on her shoulder where she had hit the ground was a constant, throbbing reminder of the chaos of the night before. Across the shelter, Taza was already awake. He stood at the edge of the overhang, looking out at the new day, not with relief, but with the keen, assessing gaze of a man reading a familiar page. He had a blanket draped over his shoulders, and in the pale morning light, the scar on his face was a stark white line against his skin. He seemed as much a part of the landscape as the ancient, weathered stones around them. He had survived the storm, but for him, it was clear that survival was not an event, but a continuous state of being. Her thirst was a physical presence, a dry, rasping thing in her throat. She looked around for a canteen, for any sign of water, but there was nothing. Taza seemed to sense her need. Without turning, he spoke. "Thirst is a warning. You listen to it now." He turned and started walking away from the shelter, his moccasins making no sound on the rocky ground. He did not look back to see if she was following. The choice, like everything else, was hers. Gritting her teeth against the pain in her shoulder, Evelyn pushed herself to her feet and followed him. He led her not to a river or a pool, but to a place where the towering rock face wept. Water, impossibly, seeped from a dark crack in the stone, trickling down a carpet of green moss to a small, shallow basin in the rock below. It was no more than a few cupfuls. A seep spring, he called it. He knelt, cupped his hands, and drank slowly. Then he looked at her. She knelt beside the tiny pool, her reflection a wavering, distorted stranger. She cupped her own hands, the water shockingly cold against her skin, and drank. It was the sweetest, purest thing she had ever tasted. He showed her how to use a broadleaf to funnel the slow trickle of water into a small clay pot he had retrieved from a hidden niche in the rocks. Every drop, his actions said, was a jewel to be treasured. She saw then that in this world, life was measured in mouthfuls. When they returned to the cave, the fire from the night before was a circle of gray ash with a few faintly glowing embers at its heart. Her stomach rumbled, a hollow ache that echoed the emptiness of the desert around them. She expected him to simply restart the fire, to perform the magic of creating flame from nothing. Instead, he handed her a simple wooden bow, a stick with a rawhide thong, and a slender spindle of wood. He took a flat piece of dry cottonwood with a small depression carved into it and placed it on the ground with a pinch of tinder. He wrapped the thong around the spindle, placed its tip in the depression, and with a small handhold of rock, showed her the steady, sawing motion required. Then he sat back and watched. The work was exhausting. Her hands, accustomed to embroidery needles and the smooth covers of books, were soft and clumsy. She fumbled with the bow, the spindle skittering out of its notch. Her arms, unused to such labor, quickly began to burn with fatigue. She worked until sweat beaded on her forehead and her breath came in ragged gasps. Nothing happened. There was no smoke, only the frustrating squeak of wood on wood. Taza remained silent, his stillness a powerful, unspoken critique. It was worse than any verbal scorn. It said, simply, that she was not yet capable. Pride and desperation warred within her. She wanted to throw the pathetic tools down, to scream at the injustice of her situation. She was a lady. She was not meant for this kind of crude struggle. But then she looked at Taza's impassive face and felt the deep, penetrating cold of the morning air. The memory of the storm, of her utter helplessness, was still fresh. She took a deep breath, repositioned the drill, and began again, focusing only on the rhythm, on the steady, insistent pressure. A thin wisp of smoke curled up from the wood. Her heart leaped. Encouraged, she quickened her pace, pushing through the pain in her arms. The smoke thickened, smelling hot and dusty, a tiny, glowing ember, no bigger than a ladybug, was born in the dark powder her frantic work had created. With hands that trembled from exertion, she carefully tipped the ember into the bundle of tinder and blew on it, a soft, steady breath, just as she had seen him do. The tinder smoldered, then caught, and a tiny, beautiful flame flickered to life. The wave of triumph that washed over her was primal and overwhelming. She had made fire. Taza gave a single, curt nod. It was not praise, but an acknowledgement of a task completed, a fact established. She was capable of making fire. Later that morning, he disappeared into the brush, moving with a silence that still unnerved her. He returned an hour later with a freshly killed rabbit. He laid it on a flat rock at her feet, and beside it, he placed his long, sharp knife. The message was unmistakable. She stared at the limp animal, at its soft fur and glassy eyes, and a wave of revulsion rose in her throat. She thought of meals served on delicate porcelain, of conversations about poetry and politics over roasted lamb. That life was not just in another country, it was on another planet. She looked at her own hands, raw and blistered from the fire drill. She felt the insistent pangs of real hunger, not the polite appetite of a drawing room, but the deep, animal craving for sustenance. She looked at Taza. His face was unreadable, his patience or impatience a complete mystery. He would not help her. He would not spare her this. This was another lesson. She picked up the knife. The handle was smooth and heavy in her hand. The task was messy and difficult. Her first cuts were hesitant and awkward, but necessity was a brutal and effective teacher. She worked with a grim determination, forcing herself to recall the anatomical drawings from her father's books. Taza watched, and only once did he intervene. He reached over, his hand briefly covering hers, to guide the blade in a clean, sure movement along a joint. "Waste nothing," he said, his voice a low murmur. "The desert gives no second chances." When it was done, they cooked the meat on sharpened sticks over the fire she had made. The taste of the roasted rabbit was rich and wild, the most satisfying meal of her life. As they ate in silence, a new understanding settled between them. It was not friendship. Not yet. It was a contract, written not in ink, but in the shared realities of their existence. "I will stay," she said, looking not at him but at her own hands, which seemed to belong to someone else. until I am strong enough to travel. Taza finished his piece of meat and wiped his hands on his leggings. When the desert says you are strong, he replied, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, you will travel. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, a life stripped down to its essential components: water, fire, food, shelter. Taza became her reluctant teacher. He taught her which plants could be eaten and which would kill, how to read the subtle story of tracks in the sand, the silent language of a bent twig or an overturned stone. He showed her how to move through the landscape not as an intruder, but as a small part of its vast, intricate web. One afternoon, they stood on a high mesa overlooking the valley. The sun was a furnace in a cloudless sky. As Evelyn scanned the horizon, a flash of light, a brilliant, metallic glint, caught her eye from miles away. It was sharp and unnatural in the organic landscape. "Look," she said, pointing. "It shines like the sun on a looking glass, or like the buttons on a soldier's uniform." The words, spoken innocently, landed with the force of a physical blow. Taza went absolutely still. The air around him seemed to grow colder. His body, usually relaxed and fluid, became rigid, coiled like a snake. His hand moved to the hilt of his knife in a motion so fast it was almost a blur. The quiet man she was beginning to know vanished, replaced by a warrior carved from stone and fury. "Fire," he said, and the word was not spoken but ripped from somewhere deep inside him. It was a low, guttural sound, full of a pain so profound it made her flinch. "They bring fire, they burn villages, they burn everything." He turned his face away, staring out at the empty expanse. But his eyes were seeing another time, another place. She could almost feel the heat of it, the ghost of smoke and the echo of screams. In that moment, she understood that the scar on his face was the least of his wounds. The deepest ones were invisible, and they were still burning. She was speechless. The polite, sanitized reports she had read in London newspapers about the Indian Wars, the detached campfire gossip she had overheard, all of it dissolved into this one man's raw and immediate pain. 100 useless phrases of sympathy died on her lips. What could she possibly say? Sorry was a meaningless word. She simply stood beside him, her silence a form of witness. She did not touch him or speak. She just shared the space, acknowledging a grief too vast for words. After a long time, the rigidity left his shoulders. He took a slow, deep breath, and the mask of stoicism slid back into place. He did not speak of it again, and she did not ask. But the wall between them had been breached. He had allowed her a glimpse into the furnace of his past, and she had not looked away. Her education continued. Her skin turned brown from the sun, and her hands grew calloused and capable. The elegant English lady was being burned away, leaving behind a woman she barely recognized, a woman who knew the taste of thirst and the triumph of a self-made fire. Taza's silence became less a barrier and more a shared language. They could sit for an hour by the fire without speaking, yet feel no awkwardness. He began to speak to her more often, not of personal matters, but of the world around them, the habits of the coyote, the signs that foretold rain. One evening, he sat sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic shing, shing, shing of steel on stone, a soothing, constant sound in the vast quiet of the desert night. Evelyn watched the sparks fly, her gaze falling on the V-shaped notch carved into the handle, worn smooth by years of use. She realized that the respect growing between them was like the edge of that blade. It was not given freely. It was being honed slowly, deliberately, through the abrasive friction of shared hardship and the steady application of mutual effort. It was a respect born not of promises, but of competence and responsibility. The gray ash from the fire settled around them, a soft blanket over the embers, a quiet testament to the memories that had not yet cooled and the fragile warmth they were beginning to build together. The quiet rhythm of their days was a fragile thing, a delicate balance of work and silence that Evelyn had come to cherish. Life was hard, but it was simple. Its demands were immediate and honest. Thirst was answered with water from the seep spring. Hunger was met with meat from a snare. The cold of night was pushed back by a fire she could now build with her own hands. In this stripped-down world, she was discovering a strength she never knew she possessed. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer her master. One morning, Taza led her higher into the rocky mesas than they had ever gone before. The air was thinner, and the view was a breathtaking panorama of ochre, crimson, and burnt sienna. He was teaching her to read the sky, to understand the language of the clouds and the flight of birds. He paused, stooping to pick something from the base of a stunted juniper tree. It was a single, perfect hawk feather, its edges sharp and its markings a clear, bold pattern of brown and white. He held it out to her on his open palm. "The hawk sees everything," he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the vast stillness. "From above, there are no secrets. The trail of a snake, the hiding place of a rabbit. You learn to see like the hawk. You learn to survive." She took the feather, its texture surprisingly soft, and tucked it into the leather cord that now served as her belt. As she looked up to thank him, she saw that he was no longer looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the ground a few paces ahead, and the ease in his posture had vanished, replaced by a coiled stillness that was more alarming than any outward show of aggression. He moved forward, dropping into a low crouch, his fingers tracing patterns in the dust that were invisible to her. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hushed. He did not answer immediately. He rose and walked a little farther, his eyes scanning the terrain, his body a study in focused intensity. He was reading a story she could not comprehend, a narrative of disturbance and intrusion. Finally, he stopped and looked back at her. "Horses," he said. The word was a flat stone dropped into a quiet pool. A dozen, maybe more. Shod horses. They ride in a line. They are not prospectors. A cold finger of apprehension traced its way down her spine. The fragile peace of their sanctuary felt as if it were about to shatter. Taza walked to the edge of the mesa, his silhouette stark against the bright morning sky. He stared out at the distant valley floor, a long, unwavering gaze. Evelyn came to stand beside him, her eyes following his. At first, she saw nothing but the shimmering heat haze rising from the desert. Then she saw it. Far to the south, a faint, wispy smudge against the horizon. It was not the whimsical dust of a whirlwind, but the deliberate, methodical dust of men on the move, men on shod horses. "Soldiers," she breathed, the word tasting of ash. The glint of light on uniform buttons she had seen weeks ago flashed in her memory. "Not soldiers of the government," Taza corrected her, his voice grim. "Their tracks are too careless. They ride for money. There is one man who leads patrols like this for a price, a man who hunts Apache for sport and for bounty. They call him Captain Roar." The name was a key turning a lock in some cold, dark room inside her. The sun-baked earth beneath her feet seemed to fall away, the vast landscape tilting and spinning. Captain Roar, here, in this impossible, remote wilderness. It could not be. It was a collision of two worlds that should never have touched, the ghost of her past rising from the dust of her present. Her face, tanned and healthy from her weeks in the desert, had gone pale beneath the bronze. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. Taza turned his head, his dark eyes narrowing, missing nothing of her sudden, raw terror. "This name has meaning for you." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, deduced from the stark evidence of her reaction. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The hawk feather tucked in her belt felt like a cruel irony. There were no secrets. Her past had found her. They made their way back to the shelter in a tense silence. The sun felt hotter now, more hostile. The familiar rocks and plants seemed to offer no comfort, no camouflage. Every shadow looked like a threat when they were back in the relative safety of the overhang. Taza built up the fire, his movements as deliberate and precise as always. But Evelyn could feel a new urgency in his actions. He was preparing. He let her sit, to gather the shredded remnants of her composure. He did not press her, did not pry. He simply waited, his patience a silent invitation to speak. Finally, she found her voice. "He is the reason I am here," she said, her words barely a whisper. She stared into the dancing flames, the fire a comforting barrier against the coldness of her memories. In England, my father was a man of some importance. Captain Rohr was an associate of his, an American, full of ambition and stories of the frontier. He wanted to marry me. She paused, the shame and anger of it still so potent. He did not court me. He assessed me. He spoke of me as if I were a thoroughbred horse he was considering for his stables. He said I was a prize, a piece of English porcelain to be displayed on his mantelpiece, a testament to his success. He wanted to own me, not love me. Taza listened, his face impassive, but his eyes were fixed on her, attentive and sharp. I refused him, she continued, her voice gaining a bit of its strength back. I told him I would rather die a spinster than be his wife. I thought that would be the end of it. But men like Captain Rohr do not accept refusal. They see it as a challenge, an obstacle to be overcome by force or by cunning. She took a shaky breath, the hardest part of the story still to be told. When he knew he could not win my consent, he decided to take it, my father's signature. He was a master of imitation. He copied it. He created a document, a marriage contract, that claimed I was promised to him. He called it a legal claim. He intended to use it to force my hand, to trap me with laws and the weight of society. He believed that with a piece of paper, he could make me his property. The moral ugliness of it filled the small space. It was a violence of ink and lies, a violation more insidious than a physical blow. My father discovered the forgery. There was a terrible confrontation. Captain Rohr was disgraced, forced to leave England, but I knew he would not forget. He is not a man who forgets a slight. I knew I could not be safe while he lived. So I sold what jewelry I had. And I ran. I came to America to disappear. I joined the wagon train thinking I could lose myself in the vastness of this country. She gave a short, bitter laugh. It seems the world is not so large after all. Taza absorbed her story without comment. He did not offer words of comfort or sympathy. They were useless luxuries. His mind was already working on the practical, lethal geometry of their situation. He looked at her, and for the first time, she felt his gaze not as an assessment of her weakness, but as an acknowledgement of her fight. He understood what it meant to be hunted. "He will not find you," Taza stated, his voice devoid of doubt. It was not a boast or a hollow promise. It was a vow, spoken with the absolute certainty of a man who knew every rock, every shadow, every trick of the wind in his domain. He rose in a single fluid motion. The time for talking was over. The time for action had arrived. He went to the fire and, with a thick piece of hide, smothered the flames until only a bed of smokeless, glowing coals remained. Then he scattered the ashes, making the spot look like an old, abandoned camp. He kicked sand over the place where she had knelt by the seep spring, erasing the signs of their presence. He gestured for her to follow him. "We move to higher ground, where the rock holds no tracks." She understood immediately. This was not a retreat, it was a tactical maneuver. He was a master of this environment, and he was using its harshness as a weapon. She found a broad, leafy branch from a scrub oak and, as they walked, she swept the ground behind them, erasing the faint impressions of her own boots, a clumsy but earnest imitation of the skills he had taught her. They moved with a new synchronicity, a shared purpose that needed no words. He would point to a rock face, and she would understand that she was to climb, to leave no trace in the soft sand below. He would pause, listening, and she would freeze, her ears straining to catch the sounds he could hear. They were no longer teacher and student, rescuer and survivor. They were two people with a single purpose, moving as one against a common enemy. They found a new hiding place. A narrow crevice high up on a cliffside, barely wide enough for them to sit side by side. From this vantage point, they could see the trail below without being seen. The dust cloud was closer now, a churning pillar of brown against the blue sky. The enemy was coming. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs, but as she looked at Taza, at the calm, focused readiness in his posture, a measure of his strength flowed into her. She was no longer a lost English girl. She was a woman who had learned to make fire in the desert, and she would not be taken. She would not be anyone's property. She belonged only to herself, and for the first time, she felt she was not entirely alone in that fight. From their perch in the high crevice, the world below was a silent, sun-bleached map. The dust cloud resolved itself into individual riders, a dozen men moving with the loose, slouching posture of hired guns, not the crisp discipline of a cavalry unit. At their head rode a man whose bearing was different, even from a distance. He sat his horse with an arrogant straightness, a ramrod posture of command. Evelyn did not need to see his face. She felt his presence like a change in the air pressure, a coming storm. Her hand went to the hawk feather at her belt, its softness a stark contrast to the knot of ice in her stomach. Beside her, Taza was a study in absolute economy of motion. He had not taken his eyes off the riders since they first appeared. He watched their progress, his mind a silent calculator of wind, distance, and intent. He saw the way they fanned out, the way the leader gestured toward the area where their first camp had been. They were not just passing through, they were hunting. The leader dismounted, a small figure in the vastness below, and knelt to the ground. He seemed to be sifting the sand, reading the ashes that Taza had so carefully scattered. Evelyn held her breath. It seemed impossible that any trace could remain, but Captain Roar was a man driven by a singular, obsessive will. His focus was a magnifying glass that could find heat in the coldest of embers. She saw him rise, turn, and point directly toward the mesas, his gesture cutting through the air with the certainty of a drawn sword. They had been found. There was no panic in Taza. He simply touched her arm, a light pressure that conveyed everything. It is time. He moved from the crevice with the fluid silence of a shadow, his rifle held easily in one hand. They did not retreat down the way they had come, but moved laterally along the cliff face, using a series of handholds and narrow ledges that Evelyn would have thought impassable only a week ago. Her body, hardened by her desert education, responded without hesitation. They descended into a labyrinth of narrow canyons, the rock walls rising up on either side, blotting out the sky. The air grew cooler, and sound became a strange, living thing, every scuff of a boot or dislodged pebble echoing and multiplying. This, she realized, was Taza's chosen ground. He was not running from Roar, he was luring him into a trap. They heard the men entering the canyon system behind them, the clatter of shod hooves on stone and the rough sound of their voices bouncing off the high walls. The sound was confusing, coming from everywhere at once. Taza pressed them into a narrow side passage, a mere crack in the rock, and waited. The first two riders came into view, their faces beaded with sweat, their eyes scanning the empty canyon with a nervous uncertainty. A rock, the size of a man's fist, detached itself from the cliff high above them and crashed to the canyon floor. The men's horses shied, whinnying in alarm. The riders cursed, their eyes drawn upward. In that moment of distraction, Taza moved. He was not a man anymore, but a blur of brown buckskin against brown rock. He incapacitated the two men with a speed that was both terrifying and beautiful, using the butt of his rifle in short, precise movements. It was over before they could even cry out. He took their rifles and ammunition belts, then melted back into the shadows. He is not a killer, she thought with a strange sense of clarity. He fought with a fierce, controlled efficiency, his goal to neutralize the threat, not to annihilate it. The sounds of the other riders grew louder. Roar's voice cut through the air, sharp with impatience. "Spread out," he commanded. "Find them. He is only one man. He cannot hide forever." Taza led Evelyn deeper into the maze. He would pause, listen to the distorted echoes, then change direction. He was playing a lethal game of hide-and-seek, using the canyon's acoustics as his ally. A shot rang out, the crack deafening in the enclosed space, followed by the whine of a ricochet. One of the men had seen a shadow, a flicker of movement, and fired blindly. They rounded a sharp bend and found themselves in a small, circular clearing, a natural amphitheater of stone. It was a dead end, or so it seemed. Taza pointed to a fissure high up on the opposite wall, a dark line that promised a way out before they could move toward it. Roar and 3 of his men appeared at the entrance to the clearing, blocking their escape. Captain Roar smiled. It was the same thin, predatory smile she remembered from the drawing rooms of London, a smile that never reached his cold, pale eyes. He looked her over, his gaze lingering on her sun-darkened skin and her simple leather belt. On the torn hem of her dress, he saw not a survivor, but a sullied prize. "So," he said, his voice dripping with a proprietary amusement, "the porcelain doll has been playing in the dirt. Did you truly think you could escape me? Evelyn, I have a legal document that says you belong to me." "I belong to myself," she said, her voice clear and steady, refusing to be intimidated. "Your piece of paper is a lie, and you are a coward." Roar's smile tightened, the amusement replaced by a flash of fury. He raised his pistol. "A savage!" he spat, looking at Taza. "You would choose this life, this filth, over civilization. I am here to rescue you from your own foolishness." Before he could say another word, Taza fired one of the captured rifles. He did not aim at Roar, but at a rock face high above him. The bullet struck with a sharp crack, sending a shower of stone fragments raining down near Roar's men. They flinched back, startled and confused. In that instant, Taza shoved Evelyn toward the fissure in the wall. "Go," he commanded. "Climb." He provided cover fire, his shots precise and deliberate. He was not trying to hit the men, but to pin them down, to kick up dust and create chaos. The canyon erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire, the sound waves crashing against each other. Evelyn scrambled up the rock face, her fingers finding holds, her boots scraping for purchase. She heard a cry of pain from below. She risked a glance down. One of Roar's men was clutching his leg. Roar himself was pressed against the canyon wall, his face a mask of rage. He saw his prize escaping. He raised his pistol, taking careful aim not at Taza, but at her. Taza saw it. He moved without thinking, throwing himself in front of her, shielding her body with his own just as Roar fired. The bullet, meant for her, tore through the fleshy part of Taza's upper arm. He grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, stumbling but not falling. Blood, shockingly dark, bloomed on his sleeve. At that moment, from his position on the canyon floor, Taza had a clear view of Roar. The captain was exposed, reloading his pistol, his face contorted with frustration. It was an easy shot. Taza brought his rifle up, the sight aligning perfectly with Roar's chest. Evelyn saw the moment stretch, saw the cold calculus in Taza's eyes. She saw him hesitate. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he lowered the rifle. He turned and followed her up the rock face, choosing life, choosing escape over vengeance. They scrambled through the fissure and into another narrow canyon. Behind them, they could hear Roar's voice, hoarse with fury, echoing off the stone. "I will find you. Evelyn, no matter where you run, I will find you. You will be mine." They did not stop moving until the sun began to dip below the canyon rim, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple. The echoes of the gunshots had long since faded, replaced by the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. They found a small, hidden alcove, a space barely large enough for them both, shielded from view by a thick growth of desert willow. Only then did Taza slump against the rock wall, his face pale and beaded with sweat beneath his tan. His sleeve was soaked with blood, and a steady drip was falling onto the sand below. Evelyn's heart constricted with a fear more potent than any she had felt for herself. Without a word, she sprang into action. The lessons of the past weeks came back to her not as memories, but as instincts. Water, fire. She took their small clay pot and found a place where moisture seeped between two rocks. It took a long time to collect enough water. While it filled, she gathered dry twigs and, using the fire drill, coaxed a small, nearly smokeless flame to life. She set the pot of water to boil. She remembered Taza pointing out a dusty green plant with small yellow flowers, telling her its leaves, when crushed, helped to clean wounds and keep the bad spirits out. She found a patch of it growing nearby and crushed the leaves between two stones, releasing a sharp, medicinal scent. She tore a long, clean strip from the hem of her petticoat, the last remnant of her old life. Taza watched her, his dark eyes clouded with pain but lucid. He did not protest or interfere. He let her work. The trust between them was now absolute. When the water was boiled and had cooled slightly, she gently cut away his sleeve with his own knife. The wound was ugly, a ragged tear in the muscle. She cleaned it as best she could with the hot water and the crushed leaves. He hissed in a sharp breath when the poultice touched his raw flesh, but did not pull away. His control was immense. She bound the wound tightly with the strip of her petticoat. Her hands, once soft and useless, were now steady and competent. As she tied the final knot, she looked at the makeshift bandage, the pristine white linen already stained with a spreading patch of crimson. Beneath it, she could see the flesh beginning to swell and darken. It was the physical mark of his sacrifice, the brutal price of her freedom. He had taken a bullet for her. The thought was a staggering weight, a debt of honor she knew she could never truly repay. All she could do was offer this small act of care, this gentle tending in the fading light. He had chosen not to kill, and she had chosen to heal. In the brutal world of the canyon, it felt like a victory. The days that followed the gunfight in the canyon were a blur of careful movement and constant vigilance. Taza's wound, though not deep, was a persistent, nagging reality. Evelyn changed the dressing twice a day, her initial revulsion replaced by a clinical focus. She saw the angry red of the flesh, the dark bruising that spread across his shoulder, and felt a cold anger toward the man who had inflicted it. The injury had slowed them down, forced them to take fewer risks, to live on less. Their supply of salt was gone, their ammunition was dangerously low, and the linen from her petticoat was nearly used up. Necessity, once again, was forcing their hand. "We need supplies," she said one evening, as she watched him favor his injured arm. It was a simple statement of fact, but it hung in the air, heavy with unspoken risk. Taza nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy outline of a mountain range. "There is a town," he said, "a day's walk, full of miners and gamblers. A loud place, a dangerous place." He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "For you, for me." "We have no choice," she replied, her voice steady. "Your arm will not heal properly without clean bandages, and we cannot survive without ammunition." They planned their approach with the care of generals mapping a battlefield. They would travel by night and hide by day, arriving at the outskirts of the town known as Tombstone just before dawn. Taza would not enter. His face, his presence, was too conspicuous. He would wait in a cluster of rocks overlooking the dusty main street, his rifle ready. Evelyn would go in alone. She would trade the few silver coins she had managed to save from the wagon wreck for the things they needed. She altered her appearance as best she could. She braided her hair tightly and tucked it under a wide-brimmed, dusty hat she had salvaged. She rubbed dirt on her cheeks to hide the paleness of her skin. and pulled a rough wool blanket over her shoulders to conceal the tattered remains of her dress. She looked less like an English lady and more like a weary prospector's wife, a woman worn down by the sun and the hardscrabble life of the territory. As she walked into Tombstone, the sudden cacophony of civilization was a physical assault. After weeks of the desert's profound silence, the noise was overwhelming, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the tinny music of a piano drifting from a saloon, the rumble of wagon wheels, the shouts of men, the braying of a mule. The air was thick with the smells of horse manure, stale beer, frying bacon, and unwashed bodies. It was a raw, vibrant, and hostile world. She kept her head down, her eyes on the dusty ground, and made her way to the Mercantile, a long wooden building with a false front and a cluttered porch. Inside, the air was cooler and smelled of coffee beans, leather, and licorice. Shelves overflowed with goods, bolts of calico, sacks of flour, barrels of nails, and boxes of patent medicines promising to cure all ills. A few grim-faced men stood around a pot-bellied stove, their conversation low and guttural. Evelyn moved to the counter, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She recited her list to the storekeeper, a balding man with a stained apron and weary eyes, salt, a box of cartridges for a Winchester rifle, a bottle of carbolic acid, and as much clean linen bandage as she could afford. The storekeeper gathered the items without a word, his movements slow and methodical. While she waited, her eyes scanned the counter. Beside a jar of pickled eggs sat a stack of freshly printed newspapers. It was a thin, smudged sheet called the Tombstone Epitaph. Her gaze drifted over the headlines about mining claims and local politics, and then she saw it. It was not on the front page, but in a prominent box set off by a crude drawing of a feathered headdress and a woman's silhouette. The headline was printed in thick, sensational letters, designed to snag the eye and inflame the imagination. The Apache ordered a graceful bride, the fierce virgin who came awakened his hidden passions. The air left her lungs in a silent rush. The noisy store faded into a distant hum. The words seemed to lift off the page and burn themselves into her mind. It was her. It was Taza. Their story, their brutal, desperate fight for survival, had been twisted into this grotesque, vulgar fantasy. She felt a profound and sickening sense of violation, as if Roar had reached across the miles and stripped her bare for the amusement of these strangers. Her hand trembled as she picked up a copy. The article beneath the headline was a masterpiece of innuendo and outright lies, a story clearly spun by Roar and sent out over the telegraph wires. It painted her as a mail-order bride from England, a foolish woman who had arranged to marry an Apache chief, only to be horrified by his savage ways. It described Taza as a brutal captor who had taken her against her will. It hinted at dark, unspeakable rituals in the wilderness. It was a story designed to appeal to every prejudice, every fear, every dark curiosity of the frontier mind. Roar had not just pursued her with guns. He was now hunting her with words, poisoning the very air she breathed. She felt the storekeeper's eyes on her. His weary indifference was gone, replaced by a new, calculating curiosity. He looked from her face to the newspaper and back again. A slow, unpleasant smile touched his lips. One of the men by the stove nudged his companion, his thumb jerking in her direction. Whispers slithered through the room like snakes. Suddenly, she was not just a customer. She was the woman from the newspaper, the fierce virgin, the Apache's bride. She could feel their eyes on her, stripping away her dusty disguise, imagining her in the arms of a savage. The shame was a physical heat that flushed her cheeks. The injustice of it was a bitter gall in her throat. She fumbled for her coins, her fingers clumsy and numb. She paid for her goods, her gaze fixed on the wooden counter. She could not meet their leering eyes. She bundled her purchases into a sack and turned to leave, the weight of their stares a physical pressure on her back. She hurried out into the blinding sunlight, her one thought to get back to Taza, to the clean, honest silence of the desert. But the story had escaped the confines of the mercantile. It was everywhere. Two women standing outside the dress shop stopped talking as she passed, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and contempt. A group of miners in front of a saloon fell silent, their crude jokes dying on their lips as they turned to stare. The headline had given them a name for her, a definition. It had made her a public spectacle. She found Taza where he had said he would be, a motionless figure in the shadows of a rock pile. He saw the look on her face before she was even close enough to speak. He rose to meet her, his hand moving instinctively toward his knife. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. She could not speak. She simply handed him the newspaper. He took it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He could not read the English words, but he understood the crude drawings. He understood the placement of the headline. He looked at her, at the raw pain and humiliation in her eyes, and his own face hardened into a mask of cold, controlled fury. She told him what it said, her voice shaking with a rage that was beginning to eclipse her shame. "He is telling the world I am a woman for sale, and you are the savage who bought me. He is turning our fight for freedom into a cheap, dirty story for their amusement." Taza folded the newspaper with a slow, deliberate movement. He understood this kind of warfare. He had seen it before. The white man's words were often more deadly than his bullets. They could turn a whole town into an enemy, could put a price on a man's head without ever firing a shot. "It is his weapon," Taza said, his voice quiet but lethal. "He uses lies to make himself strong." They needed to leave, and quickly. The town was no longer just a place of risk. It was a place of active, immediate danger. They began to move away, keeping to the alleys and the shadows, trying to slip out of Tombstone as invisibly as they had slipped in. As they passed the rear of a noisy saloon, the back door swung open, spilling a rectangle of yellow light and the foul smell of cheap whiskey into the alley. A man staggered out, a big bearded man with a gun belt slung low on his hips. His eyes were bleary with drink, but they sharpened with a hunter's recognition as they fell on Taza. He had clearly heard the description that Roar's men had been spreading. "Well, look what we have here," the man slurred, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "The redskin who steals white women. There is a bounty on your head, Apache." Taza pushed Evelyn behind him, his body shielding hers. "We want no trouble," he said, his voice flat and even. The bounty hunter laughed, a wet, ugly sound. Too late for that. He drew his pistol, its barrel wavering in his unsteady hand. He was not aiming to kill. Not yet. He was playing to the audience he knew was just inside the saloon doors. He fired a shot into the ground at Taza's feet, the explosion unnaturally loud in the narrow alley. The shot was an alarm bell. Men poured out of the saloon, their faces a mixture of drunken curiosity and mob excitement. "It is him!" Someone shouted. "Get him!" Taza did not wait. He grabbed Evelyn's arm and pulled her deeper into the maze of back alleys. They ran, the sounds of shouting and pursuit echoing behind them. They turned the corner and found their way blocked by a high adobe wall. They were trapped. Then, a small wooden door in the wall creaked open. A woman stood in the opening, her face framed by a black rebozo. She was older, her face a web of fine lines, her dark eyes filled not with fear or excitement, but with a deep, weary wisdom. She gestured them inside with a quick, urgent movement of her head. They stumbled into a small, clean courtyard that smelled of chili and wood smoke. The woman pressed the door shut, plunging the alley back into darkness. She put a finger to her lips, then led them through the courtyard and into a small, lamp-lit room. It was the kitchen of a boarding house. She looked from Evelyn's terrified face to Taza's bleeding arm. She did not ask questions. She had seen the newspaper. She had heard the vicious gossip. But her eyes held a profound skepticism, a refusal to believe the easy, ugly story. Without a word, she took a loaf of freshly baked bread from a stone oven, wrapped it in a clean cloth, and pushed it into Evelyn's hands. She filled a canteen with fresh, cool water and gave it to Taza. Then she led them to another door at the back of the kitchen. "This path," she whispered in accented English, her voice soft but clear. "It leads to the wash. No one will see you. Go with God." Evelyn stared at her, overwhelmed by this unexpected act of grace. Why she breathed. "Why are you helping us?" The woman's dark eyes met hers, and in them, Evelyn saw a shared understanding of what it was to be an outsider, to be defined and dismissed by a hostile world. "I do not believe everything I read in the papers," the woman said simply, "and I know the look of a hunted man. Now go, quickly." They slipped out the back door and into the darkness. They were free, but as they made their way back into the wilderness, Evelyn clutched the warm loaf of bread to her chest, a talisman against the coldness of the world. Roar had branded her, had tried to chain her with his lies, but in the heart of that hostile town, a quiet stranger had offered them a moment of kindness, a small, defiant act of truth. It was not enough to win the war, but it was enough to keep them fighting. She looked out at the dark silhouette of the mountains, a new, hard resolve settling in her heart. Captain Roar had told his story. Now, somehow, she would have to find a way to tell hers. The bread from the woman in Tombstone was gone in 2 days, but the warmth of her kindness lingered, a small coal of hope in the cold reality of their flight. The newspaper article had changed everything. It was a poison that had seeped into the ground, turning a vast, indifferent wilderness into a landscape of potential enemies. Every distant rider, every plume of dust, was now a source of sharp, immediate anxiety. They traveled with a new kind of caution, a weariness that went deeper than tired muscles. It was the weariness of the unjustly accused, the exhaustion of carrying a story that was not their own. Taza's wound was healing, the clean desert air and Evelyn's diligent care keeping the worst of the infection at bay. But the injury, coupled with the psychological weight of the bounty on his head, had taken a toll. He was quieter than ever, his silence now tinged with a somber, brooding quality. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching with a helplessness she despised. She had brought this new, specific danger to him. Roar was her demon, and his shadow now fell fully across Taza's life. After several days of moving steadily northward, away from the mining camps and the telegraph lines, Taza led her into a region of the territory she had never seen before. The landscape began to change, the harsh, flat plains giving way to towering mesas of deep, stratified red. The rock formations were monumental, carved by wind and water into cathedrals of stone. He led her not into a narrow, defensible canyon, but toward a wide, sweeping amphitheater of cliffs that seemed to embrace a hidden valley. The entrance was a gateway between 2 massive pillars of rock that stood like ancient sentinels. As they passed between them, the air changed. It grew still and resonant, as if the canyon itself held its breath. The silence here was different from the silence of the open desert. It was a living, breathing quiet, full of a deep, abiding peace. A thin stream, fed by a hidden spring, trickled through the center of the valley, its banks lined with cottonwoods whose leaves shimmered a brilliant green against the red stone. "My father brought me here when I was a boy," Taza said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "He said this is a place where the spirits listen, a place to speak the truth." They made camp in a shallow cave carved into the base of the towering cliff face. The rock was smooth to the touch, and etched upon its surface were figures and symbols, faint with age. There were drawings of deer and antelope, of men with bows, of spirals that represented the sun and the journey of life. They were the stories of his people, carved into the permanent memory of the stone. That night, the sky was a black velvet cloth strewn with a fortune in diamonds. The Milky Way was a luminous river flowing from one end of the canyon to the other. They sat by a small, bright fire. The day's work done. The shared meal of roasted quail finished. The tension of the past week seemed to melt away in the profound tranquility of the canyon. There were no leering eyes here, no poisoned words on a printed page. There was only the stone, the stars, and the truth. Taza stared into the flames, his face a mask of light and shadow. The firelight danced in his dark eyes, but he was seeing other fires, other nights. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough thing, raw with memories he had kept locked away for years. "The soldiers came at night," he began, his gaze never leaving the fire. It was the moon of the falling leaves. "We were celebrating the hunt. There was singing. My sister, she had just learned a new song." He paused, the memory a physical thing he had to push past. "I was young, not yet a man, but old enough to see. I was on the ridge, watching the horses, when I saw the first light. It was not a star, it was a torch." Evelyn sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap. She knew this was a sacred space, a confession that required not words, but a silent, unwavering witness. They came from all sides. They carried the fire on long poles. They touched the fire to our wickiups, which were dry from the summer. The flames, they grew so fast. They ate our homes. The sound, it was like a great beast screaming. That, and the sound of the guns. He fell silent for a long time. The only sound, the crackle of the mesquite wood in the fire and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. "I saw my father run from our lodge, his rifle in his hand. He was a great warrior. He fought. He fell. I saw my mother. She tried to run toward the stream, carrying my baby brother. A soldier on a horse." His voice broke, and he stopped, his jaw tight, his knuckles white where he gripped his knee. He did not need to finish the sentence. The image burned in the space between them, a horror beyond words. "I did not move," he whispered, and the self-loathing in his voice was a knife twisting. "I hid in the rocks. I watched them burn my world. I listened to the screams of my people. I smelled the smoke, and I did nothing. When the sun came up, there was only silence, and ash. Everything was ash." He looked up from the fire then, and his eyes met hers. The stoic mask was gone, and for the first time she saw the full, unshielded depth of his pain. "I am the only one who lived," he said, his voice thick with a guilt that had poisoned his life. "Sometimes I think I am a ghost, the one who was left behind to walk alone. The living are cursed by the memory of the dead." The air was thick with his grief. Evelyn felt a profound urge to reach out, to touch him, but she restrained herself. Pity was an insult to the magnitude of his loss. Instead, she offered him the only thing she had of equal value, her own brokenness. "I know what it is to feel like a ghost," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "To be alive, but to have the most important part of you declared dead." He looked at her, his dark eyes questioning. "I told you that Captain Rohr wanted to own me," she began. "But I did not tell you what that truly means. In my world, a woman is her father's property until she becomes her husband's property. Her value is measured by the quality of the match she makes, by the land and titles that are exchanged at her wedding. She is a beautiful piece of art, to be hung on a wall and admired. She is not supposed to have a mind or a will or a soul of her own." She picked up a small, smooth stone from the ground, its coolness a comfort in her palm. "My parents were not cruel. They loved me in their way. But they saw my refusal of Captain Rohr not as an act of self-preservation, but as an act of foolishness, a bad business decision. When Rohr produced his forged contract, when he began to spread his lies through society, something inside me broke. It was the realization that my own word, my own truth, meant nothing. A piece of paper with a man's name on it was more powerful than my own voice. I was no longer a person. I was a dispute, a scandal." She looked across the fire at Taza, at his scarred, handsome face. and she spoke a truth she had barely admitted to herself. That is why I ran. I was not just running from Roar, I was running from a world that had tried to erase me. A world that told me I did not have the right to my own life. They burned my spirit, Taza, not with torches and guns, but with whispers and signatures, with laws and expectations. They left me feeling like ash, too. Their stories, born of such different worlds, resonated with the same terrible central chord of loss and violation. They were both survivors of a kind of annihilation. They had both been hunted, one for his race, the other for her gender. They had both been told by a powerful, ruthless world that they did not matter. In the quiet of the sacred canyon, under the watchful eyes of the stars, they laid their broken pieces before each other. There were no flowery vows, no promises of a painless future. There was only the raw, unvarnished truth. They had bound their shattered lives together not with ropes of sentiment, but with the strong, unyielding threads of shared understanding. They were no longer just allies. They were companions of the soul. A comfortable silence settled between them, the silence of a wound that has finally been cleaned and exposed to the air. After a long while, Evelyn looked at the ancient carvings on the rock wall, shimmering in the firelight. "What do they say?" she asked quietly. Taza followed her gaze. "They tell the stories." He said, "The story of our people, so that we do not forget who we are." She looked at him, a new thought, a quiet, insistent need, blooming in her mind. "Will you teach me," she asked, "some of your words? I want to know what this place is called in your tongue." Taza stared at her, and a slow, profound change came over his face. The hardness, the guarded watchfulness, seemed to dissolve, replaced by a look of deep, wondering surprise. Her request was a bridge across the last chasm that separated them. It was a gesture of respect so fundamental, so pure, that it touched him in a place he thought had long since turned to stone. He nodded slowly. "The word for stone," he said, his voice soft, "is tse." He touched the ground. "The word for earth is ni." He looked up at the star-filled sky, and the word for sky is ya. She repeated the words, her English accent shaping the unfamiliar sounds. "Tse, ni, ya." He taught her the word for fire, ko, and for water, to. Each word was a gift, a small, precious piece of his world that he was placing in her hands. As she listened, as she tried to form the sounds on her own tongue, the last of the boundaries between them melted away. They were no longer the Apache and the Englishwoman, the savage and the lady. They were just Taza and Evelyn, two people by a fire, sharing a language under the silent, listening sky, in the heart of the canyon, surrounded by the stories of those who had come before. They were beginning to write their own. The days in the sacred canyon passed like a slow, clear river. The world outside, with its bounty hunters and venomous headlines, seemed to fade into a distant, half-forgotten dream. Here, in the shelter of the ancient red rocks, a new reality took root, one measured in the steady rhythm of their shared existence. The language lessons continued, becoming the quiet center of their evenings. Evelyn's tongue, once accustomed to the soft, rounded vowels of England, stumbled and then grew more confident with the hard, beautiful sounds of the Apache words. Each new word Taza taught her the name for a specific bird. The word for the color of the rock at sunset felt like another thread weaving their separate lives together. She learned that his people did not have a word for ordering a person, for possessing a soul as one would own cattle or land. The concept was alien, a sickness of the white man's world. This knowledge was a quiet balm on the wound the newspaper had inflicted. In his language, in his world, she could not be what Roar had tried to make her. One night, the wind returned, not with the violent fury of the sandstorm that had first thrown them together, but with a high, mournful cry that swept down from the snow-capped peaks far to the north. It was a wind that carried the first real bite of winter, a cold that seeped through their blankets, and made the small fire in the cave seem a fragile, precious thing. They huddled close to the flames, wrapped in their separate blankets, the silence between them comfortable and deep. Evelyn was mending a tear in Taza's sleeve, her fingers, now calloused and nimble, working the bone needle with a practiced ease. The flickering light cast his face in dramatic relief, the high cheekbones and strong jawline carved from living stone, the scar a pale river against his skin. She found herself watching the play of light in his dark, thoughtful eyes. He had been watching her, too. He saw the way the firelight caught the stray strands of her auburn hair that was no longer perfectly coiffed but wild and free, perpetually dusted with the fine red sand of the canyon. He saw the quiet competence in her hands, the strength in the set of her shoulders. This was not the frightened, defiant woman who had stumbled into his camp. This was a woman who had been remade by the desert, who had met its harshness and found an answering strength within herself. The wind howled at the mouth of the cave, a lonely, searching sound. Evelyn shivered, pulling her thin blanket tighter, without a word. Taza rose and retrieved a heavy, soft buffalo hide from a recess in the rock. It was beautifully tanned and smelled of wood smoke and sage. He unfolded it and draped it not just over her shoulders, but over them both, creating a shared shelter against the encroaching cold. The warmth of his body beside her was immediate and profound. It was a simple, practical act, a sharing of resources against the elements, but it felt like much more. The space between them, once a chasm of suspicion and cultural difference, had shrunk to nothing. Under the single and heavy robe, they were simply two people, breathing the same smoky air, listening to the same wind. His hand, calloused from the bow and the knife, came up, and his fingers brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the rough texture of his skin. He tucked the strand behind her ear, his fingers lingering for a moment against her temple. He looked at her, his dark eyes serious, holding a depth of emotion he rarely allowed to surface. When he spoke, his voice was a low murmur, barely audible above the wind, a sound meant only for her. They said, he paused, searching for the English words, the hateful words that had branded them both. They said, the Apache ordered a graceful bride. The phrase, spoken in his voice, lost its venom. It was no longer a public accusation, but a private, shared memory of a hurt they had endured together. He looked away from her then, his gaze turning inward, toward the landscape of his own soul. But I did not order you, Evelyn, he said, his voice quiet but intense. The desert brought you to me. The storm gave you to this place. He turned back to her, and his eyes held a raw vulnerability that made her heart ache. And you? He struggled for a moment, the confession a difficult thing for a man who had lived his life behind a wall of stoic silence. You awakened the part of me that was dead, the part that burned to ash with my village. His words were a revelation. He was not just offering comfort. He was offering her the most profound truth of his own wounded heart. He was telling her that she was not a burden, not a complication, but a source of life. She had, without knowing it, walked into the ruins of his soul and planted a single, stubborn flower. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. They were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of a deep, overwhelming gratitude. To be truly seen, to be understood in this way, was a gift she had never known. She had spent her life being defined by others. As a daughter, a prize, a scandal. Taza saw only her. She reached up and placed her hand against his cheek, her palm resting against the faint, raised line of his scar. He did not flinch. He closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into her touch as if it were an anchor in a storm-tossed sea. There were no more words to be said. Their shared pasts, their separate pains, their quiet alliance forged in hardship, it all culminated in this single, silent moment of understanding. She leaned forward, and he met her halfway. They rested their foreheads together, a gesture of profound and trusting intimacy. His skin was warm, and she could feel the slow, steady beat of his pulse at his temple. They breathed in unison, their breath mingling, tasting of wood smoke and the faint, clean scent of the coming rain. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His hand was strong and sure, a hand that knew how to make fire and track game, how to fight and how to heal. In its grasp, she felt not captured, but safe, utterly and completely safe. They stayed that way for a long time, two solitary souls finding a shared home in the simple, profound connection of touch. The wind could rage, the world outside could hunt them with its lies and its bullets, but in this small, sacred space, under the shelter of the single buffalo hide, they were untouchable. Her decision was made not in her mind, but in her heart. It was not a calculation of risk or a weighing of options. It was a simple, undeniable truth. She was no longer staying because she had nowhere else to go. She was staying because he was her place to be. This quiet, wounded man, this survivor who had taught her to survive, was her home. After a long while, he pulled back slightly. Though he did not release her hand, he reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and drew something out. He placed it in her free palm. It was a simple thong of tanned deerskin, no thicker than her little finger, but woven into it with porcupine quills dyed in subtle, earthy colors was a symbol, a single, straight line that was met by another, winding line. Like a river joining a path, the craftsmanship was intricate, the leather worn soft with age and handling. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice still low and reverent, "and her mother's before her. It is the sign of our family. It means two paths walking as one, not a path that is owned, but a path that is shared." He took it from her palm and gently, carefully, tied it around her wrist. It was not a manacle, not a brand of ownership like the one Roar had tried to impose with his forged contract. It was a quiet invitation, an offering. He was not claiming her. He was asking her to walk beside him. She looked down at the deerskin tie on her wrist, at the ancient symbol of his people. It felt as soft as a whisper and as strong as the red stone of the canyon. She closed her hand over it. A silent acceptance, a vow that needed no words. He had not ordered a bride. The desert had brought him a partner. And in the heart of the great, lonely wilderness, their two paths had finally become one. The peace they found in the sacred canyon was a fragile, precious thing. A pool of still water in a world of violent currents. They stayed for a week, then another, allowing Taza's arm to heal completely, allowing their own frayed spirits to mend in the deep. Resonant silence. They had managed to acquire a hardy Mustang from a quiet Jiao Yi at a remote trading post, a necessary risk that granted them mobility. The horse, which Evelyn named Dust Devil, became a third, silent partner in their small company. In the shelter of the canyon, the future felt like a possibility again, a path they might walk together. But the hawk, when it appeared, was a stark reminder that their path was not yet their own to choose. Taza saw it first. He had been teaching Evelyn how to read the subtle shifts in the wind when his body went rigid. His gaze fixed on a single, dark speck circling high in the brilliant blue sky. It was a red-tailed hawk, a common sight, but this one was not hunting. It was not riding the thermals in lazy, drifting circles. It was following a deliberate, invisible line across the desert floor miles to the south. Its flight path too purposeful, too straight. "It is a scout," Taza said, his voice a low growl of disappointment and renewed tension. "It follows riders. They are too far away for us to see, but the hawk sees them, and it tells me they are moving with the patience of men who are tracking, not just traveling." The peace shattered. The canyon, once a sanctuary, now felt like the jaws of a trap. Roar's persistence was a malevolent force of nature, as relentless as the sun. They had to move. The decision was made without discussion, a grim, unspoken consensus. Evelyn packed their meager supplies, the remaining salt and ammunition from Tombstone, dried meat, and 2 full water skins with a swift, practiced efficiency. She was no longer a stranger to sudden flight. "The trails will be watched," Taza said as he saddled Dust Devil. "We cannot go west into the mountains or east toward the river. We must go north, across the playa." Evelyn knew what he meant. The playa was a great, dry lakebed, a pan of cracked, white earth that stretched for miles, as flat and featureless as a sheet of bone. It offered the most direct route, but it was a desperate gamble. On the playa, there was no cover, no water, no shade. They would be completely exposed. Tiny figures crawling across a vast, white canvas, visible for miles. It was a race against being seen. They left the sacred canyon at dusk, its red walls glowing like embers in the fading light. It felt like leaving the only real home she had ever known. They rode through the night, the horses' hooves making soft, muffled sounds in the sand. When the sun rose, they were on the edge of the great white plain. It was even more vast and intimidating than she had imagined, a landscape of bleached emptiness that seemed to swallow the light. The heat was a physical blow. The sun beat down from above and reflected up from the baked white earth, creating a disorienting, shimmering glare. Heat mirages danced on the horizon, creating illusions of water that mocked their thirst. They dismounted and walked, leading the horse to conserve its strength. The air was dead still and tasted of dust and salt. Hours passed. The sun climbed to its zenith, a white-hot eye in a merciless sky. The change came subtly at first. A faint breeze stirred the dead air, a whisper that offered no relief from the heat. The sky to the west, which had been a flawless, pale blue, now had a dirty, yellowish haze gathering on the horizon. Taza stopped, his head lifted, sniffing the air like an animal. "Another one," he said, his voice grim. "A big one." Evelyn felt a knot of cold fear tighten in her stomach. The memory of the first sandstorm was still a vivid terror. To be caught in one out here, on this featureless plain, was a death sentence. "We must get to the rocks on the other side," he said, pointing to a faint, dark line on the northern horizon. "It is our only chance for shelter." They began to move faster, their desperate race no longer against Roar's eyes, but against the gathering fury of the sky. The wind picked up, no longer a whisper but a rising moan. It began to lift the fine white alkali dust from the playa, creating a low, horizontal fog that stung their eyes and coated their throats. The yellow haze in the west grew into a monstrous, churning wall of brown, a solid cliff of sand and grit that was advancing on them with terrifying speed. The horse, sensing the storm, became agitated. It pulled at the reins, its eyes rolling, its whinnies lost in the rising shriek of the wind. The sun was blotted out. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of roaring wind and blinding, scouring sand. The storm hit them with the force of a locomotive, a solid impact that nearly knocked them off their feet. In the chaos, the horse reared, its panic absolute. The lead rope was ripped from Taza's hand. For a moment, the animal was a terrified silhouette in the swirling gloom. And then it was gone, swallowed by the storm, their water skins, their food, their mobility all gone with it. "Taza!" Evelyn screamed, her voice a thin thread against the roar of the wind. He grabbed her, his arm a steel band around her waist, pulling her close. "To the rocks!" He shouted directly into her ear. "It is all that matters now." They linked arms and stumbled forward, blind in the brownout. The wind was a physical weight and trying to push them down, to bury them. The sand was not just in the air. It was a moving carpet under their feet, pulling at their ankles. Every breath was an agony of grit and dust. They were drowning in the air, just when Evelyn thought she could not take another step, that she would simply fall and let the sand cover her. Her foot hit something solid. Rock. They had made it. They clawed their way forward, finding a shallow depression in a low outcrop of black, volcanic stone, a space barely large enough for them to huddle together. They pressed themselves into the hollow as the storm raged around them, a furious living thing trying to claw them from their fragile shelter. The storm lasted for hours. When it finally began to subside, it left behind a world transformed, buried under a new layer of fine, soft sand. The air was thick and still, the silence profound. They were alive, but they were stripped of everything. They had only the clothes on their backs, a knife, a rifle with a handful of cartridges, and a single, small water skin that Evelyn had been carrying over her shoulder, now containing only a few precious mouthfuls of water. They waited until the sun began to sink before they moved. Taza divided the last of the water, pouring a small amount into her cupped hands, then taking an equal share for himself. The single shared swallow was a sacrament, a communion of the doomed. The days that followed were a walking nightmare. The sun was their tormentor, their skin, unprotected, burned and blistered. Their lips cracked and bled. Thirst was a constant, raging fire in their throats, a madness that frayed the edges of their sanity. They walked in a grim, silent procession, their world shrunk to the agonizing effort of placing one foot in front of the other. Evelyn shed the last vestiges of her former self. The polite, civilized woman was a distant ghost. All that was left was a core of pure, stubborn will. She did not cry, she did not complain, she did not beg for rest. She matched Taza step for grueling step. Her mind focused on a single, repeating litany: survive, keep him alive. On the third day, Taza began to falter. The long-term effects of his wound, combined with the brutal dehydration, were taking their toll. His steps became unsteady, and a fine tremor started in his hands. Taza, who had seemed as indestructible as the rocks around them, was being broken by the desert. He stumbled and fell to one knee, his body seized by a violent, cramping shudder. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to grip Evelyn's heart, but she forced it down. Panic was a luxury. Action was survival. She remembered the seep spring, the way life-giving water had wept from the rock. She looked around at the sun-baked landscape, the seemingly lifeless stone. Taza had taught her to see, to look for the subtle signs. She left him and began to search, her eyes scanning the base of the rock formations. She looked for a place where the rock was darker, a place where a hardy, deep-rooted plant had managed to find purchase. She ran her hand along the stone, feeling for a trace of coolness. Finally, she found it, a deep fissure in a slab of granite that felt perceptibly cooler than the surrounding rock. There was no visible water, but there was a faint, damp feeling deep within the crack. She tore another strip from her ravaged dress, the fabric now little more than rags. She twisted it into a tight wick and pushed it as deep as she could into the fissure. Then she waited. It was an act of pure faith, slowly, agonizingly. A dark patch of moisture began to appear on the cloth. Drop by precious drop, the rock was giving up its hidden water. She brought the damp cloth back to Taza. He was lying on his side, his body still trembling, his eyes half closed and glassy. "Taza," she said, her voice a harsh croak. She knelt beside him and squeezed the cloth over his cracked lips. A few drops of water trickled into his mouth. It was not enough to quench his thirst, but it was enough to bring a flicker of awareness back to his eyes. For the next hour, she repeated the process, a slow, laborious ritual of survival. She would wick the moisture from the rock, bring the damp cloth to his lips, and squeeze the few precious drops into his mouth. It was a painstaking, back-breaking act of love and will. Taza watched her, the tremors in his body slowly subsiding. He saw her face, blistered and raw from the sun, her eyes burning with a fierce, protective intensity. He saw her hands, patient and steady as she worked. He had taught her the skills of the desert, but he had not taught her this indomitable will. this refusal to surrender, came from a place deep inside her that he was only now beginning to understand. It was a strength that astonished him. As the sun set, casting long, merciful shadows across the tortured land, he was able to sit up. She offered him the cloth one last time. He took it, but instead of drinking, he gently touched the damp cloth to her own bleeding lips. It was an acknowledgement, a transfer of command. She had saved him. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a new kind of reverence, an awe that went beyond respect or affection. He had seen her as a survivor. He had seen her as a partner. Now, he saw her as a force of nature in her own right, a woman as fierce and resilient as the desert itself. They were broken, battered, and on the edge of death, but they were together, and as they prepared to face another day, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that as long as she was breathing, they would not be defeated. The agonizing journey from the playa had forged them into something new, something harder and more resilient than either of them had been before. Their shared ordeal was a crucible that had burned away everything but the essential core of their bond, leaning on each other. They had limped away from the edge of death and found their way into the foothills, a broken landscape of ravines and scrubland that promised, if not comfort, then at least the possibility of water and shadow. They found it at the mouth of a deep, narrow canyon, a trickle of clear water seeping from a rock face to form a small, life-giving pool. Relief, so potent it was almost painful, washed over Evelyn. They were weak, their bodies screaming with the protest of overtaxed muscles and sun-scorched skin. But they were alive. As Taza knelt to drink, she stood watch, the rifle he had given her feeling like a natural extension of her arm. This was their new reality. One would rest while the other guarded. The sound came without warning, a sound that did not belong in the natural world, the sharp clatter of a horseshoe on stone. It was followed by another, and another. Evelyn's heart seized. She saw Taza freeze, his head lifting, his entire body becoming a single, focused instrument of attention. He rose slowly, his eyes meeting hers across the small pool. There was no fear in his gaze, only a grim, weary finality. The hunt was over. The stand would be made here. They appeared at the mouth of the canyon, blocking the only entrance, their figures dark silhouettes against the harsh afternoon sun. Captain Rohr sat his horse in the center, flanked by the handful of men who remained with him. They looked as worn and trail-weary as their quarry, but their eyes held the vicious glint of predators who had finally cornered their prey. There was no time for words, no room for retreat. Taza moved with a speed that belied his exhaustion. He pushed Evelyn back, toward a jumble of massive boulders that offered some cover. The rocks above them, he said, his voice low and urgent, his words a plan, not a plea. He pressed one of the captured rifles into her hands, its metal hot from the sun. Do not aim for the men, aim for the rocks. Keep them looking up. When I move, you move to the other side. Do you understand? She nodded, her throat too dry to speak. He was not telling her to hide. He was making her his partner in this final, desperate battle. He gave her a look, a brief, intense connection that spoke of everything they had shared, a silent testament to the path they now walked as one. Then he was gone, melting into the rocks on the opposite side of the small clearing. The first shot of the battle was hers. She rested the heavy rifle on a boulder, took a shaky breath, and fired at the cliff face high above Rohr's head. The report of the gun was a deafening crack that echoed through the canyon. A plume of red dust and rock fragments erupted from the cliff, raining down near the horsemen. The horses shied and stamped nervously. The men cursed, their attention drawn upward, their confidence momentarily shaken. The battle became a deadly, tactical dance. Taza was a ghost, firing a single shot from one position, then using the echoing acoustics of the canyon to make it seem as if the sound had come from somewhere else entirely before appearing in a new spot. He was not wasting ammunition trying for impossible shots. He was waging a war of nerves. making his presence seem larger, more ubiquitous. Than it was. He was using the canyon itself as a weapon. Evelyn followed his lead, her fear sublimating into a cold, sharp focus. She moved when he signaled, scrambling from one cluster of rocks to another, her shots carefully placed to create diversions, to keep the enemy off balance. The smell of black powder was acrid in the air, a stinging perfume that filled her lungs. She was no longer a victim. She was a combatant, fighting not just for her own life, but for his. Two of Roar's men, emboldened by greed or stupidity, dismounted and tried to advance on foot. Taza, anticipating the move, had loosened a large, precariously balanced rock high above. With a single, well-placed shot at its base, he sent it crashing down. It did not hit the men, but it landed in their path with a ground-shaking thud, and they scrambled back in terror to the relative safety of the canyon mouth. The fight settled into a tense stalemate. Roar's men were pinned down, unwilling to risk advancing into the deadly, unpredictable maze of rocks. But Taza and Evelyn were trapped, their escape route cut off. The sun beat down, and the black shadows of the canyon walls began to lengthen. It was Roar, his patience shredded by the defiance of his quarry, who finally broke the deadlock. While Taza's attention was focused on the men at the entrance, Roar, under the cover of a volley of fire from his men, dismounted and began to make a perilous climb up the steep side of the canyon, his movements a desperate, clumsy imitation of Taza's own skill. He was driven by a singular, obsessive need. Evelyn saw him first, a flicker of movement high on the canyon wall. She raised her rifle, but before she could fire, he had scrambled the last few feet and was upon her. He grabbed her from behind, his arm a brutal vice around her throat, the cold, hard steel of a knife pressing against her skin. "Drop the rifle." "Apache," Roar screamed, his voice raw with triumph and exertion, his breath hot on her neck. "Or she dies." Taza emerged from the shadows, his face a mask of stone, his rifle held loosely at his side. He saw the knife at Evelyn's throat, the manic, possessive glare in Roar's eyes. "It is over," Roar snarled, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. He tightened his grip on Evelyn, dragging her toward the edge of a high, flat ledge. "You belong to civilization," he hissed into her ear, the words a distillation of all his arrogant, proprietary rage. "You will come back with me, and I will teach you to forget this filth." Evelyn did not struggle. She did not cry out. She met Taza's gaze over Roar's shoulder, and in her eyes, there was no fear, only a clear, unwavering fire. She turned her head, her cheek brushing against the rough fabric of Roar's sleeve. "I belong to freedom," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying an absolute, unbreakable conviction. Her defiance was the spark. Taza saw the opening. He did not fire. He threw his rifle to the side and in the same motion, launched a rock with stunning force and accuracy. It struck the cliff face just beside Roar's head. Roar flinched instinctively, his head jerking back, his grip on Evelyn loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Taza needed. He surged forward, not as an attacker, but as a force of nature. He slammed his shoulder into Roar, breaking his hold on Evelyn and sending Roar stumbling backward, his arms flailing as he went over the edge of the ledge. As he fell, a last spiteful act of rage, Roar fired his pistol. The shot was wild, aimed at nothing and everything. The sound of it was swallowed by the canyon. Taza stood for a moment, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on Evelyn's. Then, without a sound, his knees buckled. He crumpled silently, falling from her view behind the rock ledge where they stood. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Evelyn stared at the empty space where Taza had been, below. She could hear Roar groaning, injured from the fall but alive. She looked down and saw him, scrambling to retrieve his pistol, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. He was helpless, exposed. Revenge was a simple, easy thing. A single shot. Her rifle was on the ground beside her. Her mind screamed with 1,000 voices, the humiliation of the newspaper, the terror of the chase, the violation of his knife against her skin. She could end it, right now. Then, a memory of Taza's voice, from a quiet night in the sacred canyon, a whispered contingency plan. If one of us falls, the other does not fight for revenge. The other runs, to the North Fork of the river. Do not let them take my reason for living. She looked from Roar's struggling form to the still, silent ledge. Her reason for living. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an affirmation. She snatched up her rifle, not to kill, but to survive. She scrambled to the edge of the ledge. Taza lay in a heap, a dark, spreading stain on his side. His face as pale as ash, but he was breathing. She hooked her arm under his shoulders, her own exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength. "Taza," she whispered, her voice raw. "I am here." She began to drag him. It was a brutal, agonizing effort. His dead weight was a terrible burden, but she would not leave him. She pulled him away from the edge, away from the sounds of Roar and his men, toward a narrow, almost invisible game trail Taza had pointed out to her earlier, a secret path that wound its way up and out of the canyon. Justice was not a bullet. Justice was not Roar's death. Justice was this her and the man she loved, choosing life, choosing their future, choosing to not let his hatred be the final word in their story. She put her head down and pulled, her feet finding purchase on the steep, rocky path, her heart pounding out a single, desperate rhythm: freedom, freedom, freedom. The secret path out of the canyon was a brutal, unforgiving climb. Every step was an agony. Evelyn's body, already pushed far beyond the limits of its endurance, screamed in protest, but she did not stop. She looped a strip of leather under Taza's arms and around her own shoulders, and she pulled. She was no longer just a woman. She was a beast of burden, her only purpose to move the precious, broken weight of the man she loved away from the sound of guns and toward the promise of water. Taza drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness. Sometimes he would murmur words in his own language, his voice rough and broken. At other times, he would try to move, to help her, but his limbs would not obey. His blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage she had applied, and a fresh, dark stain was spreading across his buckskin shirt. The memory of his instructions was her only compass, the North Fork of the river, a place of high country, of clean water and deep forests, a place to heal, or a place to die. She did not know how many days passed. Time had dissolved into a single, continuous present of effort and pain. The sun rose and set. The stars wheeled across the sky. And still she walked. Her world shrunk to the few feet of rocky ground in front of her. She found water in the mornings, collecting dew from broad leaves with a desperation that had become second nature. She snared a single, thin rabbit and cooked it over a tiny, smokeless fire, feeding him the tenderest pieces, her own hunger a distant, secondary concern. Finally, she heard it, a sound she had almost forgotten, a sound more beautiful than any symphony, the gentle, persistent murmur of moving water. She stumbled through a stand of tall, fragrant ponderosa pines and saw it, a wide, clear stream flowing over a bed of smooth, gray stones. The North Fork. She had made it. Her strength gave out. She carefully lowered Taza to the ground in the soft pine needles at the river's edge, then collapsed beside him, her body trembling with an exhaustion so profound it felt like death itself. Taza did not move. His face was a waxy, unnatural pale beneath his skin, his breathing shallow, a faint, fluttering whisper. She touched his cheek. It was cold. A sob, raw and ragged, tore itself from her throat. After everything, the storm, the desert, the bullets, The lies was this to be the end, to have come so far, to have fought so hard, only to lose him here, in this place of peace. She lay her head on his still chest, and she wept. She cried for the life they had almost had, for the home they had not yet built. She cried for the man who had shown her the meaning of freedom, and for the woman she had become in his presence. Her tears fell onto his shirt, mingling with the dust and the blood. She must have drifted into a state of exhausted unconsciousness, because when she opened her eyes again, the light had changed. The harsh afternoon sun had softened into the golden glow of late evening. A hand, warm and familiar, was resting on her hair. She lifted her head. Taza's eyes were open. They were clear and lucid, the fever gone. He was looking at her, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. "Do not cry for me, little bird," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "The fire, it could not take me then. It cannot take me now. I have risen from the ashes before." The relief that flooded her was a physical wave, so powerful it left her weak and dizzy. He was alive. The desert, which had tried so hard to kill them, had in the end given them this final, miraculous gift. The weeks that followed were a quiet testament to the resilience of the human body and spirit. They found a sheltered meadow high in the juniper forest, a place with a clear view of the surrounding country and a spring that ran cold and sweet. Here, they began the slow, deliberate work of building a life. Evelyn used her knowledge of herbs to keep Taza's wound clean, and slowly, day by day, his strength returned. He taught her how to build a proper shelter, a wickiup made from juniper branches and insulated with hides and packed earth, a small, warm dome that was a testament to their shared labor. It was not a grand house, but it was the first true home either of them had ever known. A place built not of brick and inheritance, but of their own 2 pairs of hands. They worked the rich soil of the meadow, planting the wild potatoes that Taza knew how to find. They set traps for fish in the clear, cold river. Life became a simple, satisfying rhythm of shared tasks and quiet companionship. The ghosts of their pasts, of a sterile English drawing room, of a burning Apache village, began to recede, replaced by the solid, reassuring reality of a sprouting garden and a warm fire at night. One afternoon, a visitor arrived. He was a lone trapper, a grizzled old man with eyes the color of the faded sky, leading a mule laden with furs. He was the first person they had seen since the canyon, and Evelyn felt a flicker of the old fear. But the man was quiet and respectful, and he shared their fire and their food without asking questions they could not answer. He brought news from the world below. He spoke of the talk in the towns, of a disgraced captain named Roar. The man had returned to Tombstone, not as a hero, but as a failure. His fabricated story about the mail-order bride had begun to unravel. The woman at the boarding house, it was said, had spoken quietly of the hunted look in their eyes. The men Roar had hired, paid only a fraction of what they were promised, had grumbled in the saloons about a pointless, bloody venture that had gained them nothing. Roar, his leg badly broken and his reputation in tatters, had been quietly dismissed from his post. He was a remote danger now, a bitter, broken man with no power and no credibility. The trapper also spoke of a new story that was beginning to be whispered, a story of an English lady and a reclusive Apache warrior who had stood together against a tyrant. Some, he said, were even admitting they had been wrong to believe the lurid tales in the paper. The truth, it seemed, was a slow, stubborn plant, but it was beginning to push its way through the hard, poisoned ground of Roar's lies. After the trapper left, a new kind of peace settled over them, the peace of a battle truly won. The threat had not just been defeated, it had been discredited. That night, as they sat by their fire, the scent of pine and wood smoke sweet in the cool mountain air, Taza took a piece of smooth, pale cottonwood. With the tip of his knife, he began to carve. Evelyn watched as a familiar symbol took shape under his skilled hands, a straight path being met by a winding river. Two paths walking as one. But he did not stop there. He continued to carve, his movements sure and deliberate. He added a circle around the two joined paths. And from the circle, he etched the shape of a sheltering roof and the lines of a tended garden. He held it out to her. It was no longer just about two paths meeting. It was about what they had built together. A home, a life, a future. She took the carving, its surface still warm from his hands. She looked from the symbol of their new life to the man who sat before her, his face calm and strong in the firelight. The deerskin tie he had given her was a soft, familiar presence on her wrist. "We are no one's merchandise," she said, her voice quiet, but filled with a strength that was as deep and solid as the mountains around them. He nodded, a slow, deep understanding passing between them. They were not hiding. They were living. They were free. And they would remain here, in the home they had built with their own hands, for as long as they chose, ready to step back into the world and speak their own story, not as victims, but as survivors. If and when the time was right, their justice was not in the fall of their enemy, but in the quiet, profound dignity of their own shared life. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are tuning in from so we can all connect, and remember to subscribe to Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help it reach more ears.